Hello, I'm Cathal Summers,
And I'm Deirdre Glynn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors, and you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
On today's episode, Teagasc advisor Kieran Kenny from the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advisory Programme and committee member on the National Pesticide and Drinking Water Action Group talks to us today about the importance of good practice when using pesticides.
Did you know the limit set for pesticides in water in Ireland is equivalent to one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool?
With COVID-19 impacting on our lives in many ways, has it had an impact on our water quality and pesticide usage?
With pressure mounting on agriculture to reduce the use of pesticides and to improve practice to avoid loss to water, Kieran tells us the do's and don'ts.
Kieran explains that chemical weed control should never be your first port of call. Always consider alternative management practices first. So we started off by asking Kieran to tell us more about his role in the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advisory Programme, working with farmers to improve water quality.
I'm the ASSAP advisor for the Longford and Roscommon region. So I suppose my main role involves engaging with the farmers in the specific PAs or catchments and trying to give them support and advice in terms of the issues that are present with water quality in the different catchments. So it's an interesting role. The issues vary a lot from nutrient loss, mainly phosphorus, but I also find some issues with pesticides, which we'll be discussing maybe today.
So Kieran, you have a particular interest in pesticides. Can you tell me a little bit about your role with the National Pesticide and Drinking Water Action Group, and how did that come about?
Well, I suppose firstly how it came about. I would have had an interest with pesticides and drinking water over a number of years previous to when I was an ASSAP advisor, and back in I think it was 2018. I think it was I did a fairly intensive survey with clients in North Roscommon on pesticide use, and I happened to I was asked to give a presentation of the details of the results from that survey at one of the meetings with the Pesticide Drinking Water Action Group, and I suppose they were fairly well impressed with the findings and the work that I did. So from that, I kind of got a relationship with some of the group, particularly with John Keogh, who's the AFA or AFAP representative. It's the association that represents the chemical industry. And I suppose I've developed a relationship with him in terms of organising events in different areas in the Roscommon Longford region, promoting best practice in terms of the use of pesticides.
Just Kieran, on the survey, what kind of information did you come back on the survey, or was it kind of about attitudes or about?
Well, it was more or less more to do with the use, I suppose, and awareness. And it pointed out, obviously, critical information in terms of lack of awareness, in terms of buffer zones, even the simple things of being registered and having to be trained to be a professional user to use pesticides, all that kind of information. Now, one critical message it did highlight, and it was a positive message, and you've probably seen it yourselves in terms of the presentations that have been given over the years. There was something like 96% of the group of farmers highlighted that they were very concerned or extremely concerned if they were aware that pesticides were present in their drinking water.
Yeah, look, and that's a positive in itself, like, because like if we know there's an issue there, the next step is that we just need a bit of support, I suppose, and try and figure out, look for solutions. And look, farmers they're innovators, they're engineers. All they want is that bit of support, and they'll implement it on the ground.
Absolutely.
The National Pesticide Drinking Water Action Group, is that a collaboration of loads of different organisations together? And so you're probably representing Teagasc on it, Kieran, is it?
Yeah, there's a range of different agencies on it. The obvious ones, the likes of EPA, Irish Water, is chaired by the department. You have the farm orgs, you have the local authorities, National Federation of Group Water Scheme, Law Pro, etc. Myself then and Michael Hennessy are the representatives for Teagasc and ASSAP on it.
Yeah. I think that is the way forward in water quality, certainly on farms, that we try and everyone work together to a common goal. And I think farmers appreciate that, because they don't want 10 different people coming in the gate telling the same story, trying to work as a unit together.
Yes.
One other question, talking about pesticides, so they get into our water, so that's the issue, but who monitors pesticides in water? And if we wanted to look for some local information on our own river, could we find that? And lastly, I suppose, if pesticides does get into drinking water, what happens?
Well, so to take it from the start, the drinking water is monitored by Irish Water at the tap. So during the spraying season from April to November, Irish Water usually take a minimum of one sample per month from the tap water in a drinking water supply. So it could be from a service station or from a shop or whatever. That sample hopefully is clear, but if it does show up an exceedance for a particular pesticide, it's obviously notified then to a number of agencies, including the local authority, and it's also, the exceedance is obviously notified to the EPA, and it's the EPA, they have the role of opening up an investigation file for that exceedance within that drinking water supply.
Kieran, how long could they be on a watch? Is it 2 years, 3 years?
Just to explain, there's two lists. We'll say the investigation files, depending on the number of exceedances within a spraying season. If it's 1 to 3 exceedances, it goes on a watch list. Now, if there's more than 3, if it's 4 plus, it's on what they call an ACT list or a remedial action list, and obviously they're the high priority drinking water supplies. So to answer your question, how long is it on the watch list? It'll be left on the watch list until there's 1 full year's clear samples taken. Now that 1 year could go over 2 calendar years. It doesn't necessarily have to be 1 full calendar year.
That's on the drinking side of the house. So if it does get into my drinking water, then am I drinking that, or do they treat it, or what happens to it?
Well, an important message, I suppose, firstly, is to reduce any fear that the public may have. All of these exceedances for drinking water are well below any public health issue that or any public health concern, because the limit for drinking water that's set for exceedances is something like, now it depends on the chemical, but for instance, like MCPA, it's 7,000 times less than the standards that's the World Health Organization have set for public water. By and large, it's not an issue for public health.
If it's not really an issue for public health, what is it, more biodiversity concerns, in Kieran, that we're so worried about?
Because it was a standard that's set back in the 1980s, and the standard is set so low that it's almost zero. But because there is a standard or a limit, obviously action has to be taken.
And look, we don't want, in reality, like we don't even want a drop of it in our waters. For everyone, it's better to have it clean. Yeah.
And to go back to your comment about the treatment, in some countries they do treat the drinking water, and it's possible to do that if you only had a number of drinking water supplies. But in Ireland, unfortunately, there are so many supplies, something like 860 drinking water supplies around the country. So it's not an option to do that. It would be too expensive.
So Kieran, what pesticides are causing the problem, and how do they get into the water supply, and how much of the chemical is a particular issue?
I'll deal with them for the last question you asked first. The limit or the standard is set at as close as they could have got to zero. So it's 0.1 micrograms per litre for an individual pesticide. Now that's equivalent to 1 part chemical is to 10 billion parts water. So it's virtually zero. It's equivalent to one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or if you like, 1 second in 317 years. So it's very, very, very small. In terms of the chemicals or the pesticides that are causing the issues, it's largely the exceedances, we'll say, that have been found over the last number of years. Most of those exceedances seem to relate to grassland herbicides. And the probable reason for that is it's riskier kind of chemistry to use on the land. So the predominant ones would be phenoxyacids such as MCPA and 2,4-D. They would account for about 2/3 of the exceedances. The other ones would be glyphosate, fluroxyphor, chlorpyrrolid, and triclopyr. The reason, I suppose, you might ask, why would grassland herbicides, like some of these products can be used on tillage farms as well for weed control. But the reason they're probably riskier, the phenoxyacids are riskier in a grassland situation, probably relates to greater use, but also they're mainly used to control rushes. And obviously where rushes are, you have kind of wetter soils, land that's near or close to saturation. So there's a greater risk that there's going to be a movement of that pesticide towards the water in that situation.
I suppose the time of the year we're coming into as well now, and it's been a kind of funny year down in our part of the country. It's quite dry. It's been a cold start to the year. Grass is not growing very well the last couple of weeks. Not much spraying done on grassland yet, I would reckon, but we will be coming into docks, spraying for docks and that kind of stuff, and maybe burning off some grass with glyphosate. The one thing I would say is, look, the European Commission's biodiversity strategy has come out, and it's looking to reduce chemical pesticides by 2030 by 50%, which is a big jump. On the farming side of the house, we rely quite heavily on pesticides, I suppose, or, well, if we talk about pesticides, we're talking about herbicides, pesticides, and we're talking about fungicides to control weeds and pests and funguses. So the thing I would say to you, I suppose, now is, what are the do's and don'ts? Like, we need them, but we need to reduce pesticides, but we still have to use them in a correct manner. What would be your do's and don'ts of using pesticides?
To break it down, best management practices is really the key advice. So to start from the start to the finishing of the spraying process might be the best approach to it. So firstly, you need to ensure that the sprayer operator is registered, because obviously if he's registered, he's got training in terms of best practice and the correct methods and procedures to follow. The sprayer needs to be tested and well maintained and calibrated as well. One of the key messages using pesticides is obviously you should always read the label, and regardless of how often you've used a chemical before, you should always read the label in advance of spraying, because that has critical information, including the rates of concentrate to use and the water volume, etc. Definitely, one of the highest risk areas in terms of the whole procedure is spillages during mixing and filling, and this needs to be avoided. So you need to be particularly careful with that. It's probably advisable to have some sort of a containment system when you're handling the concentrate, to have something like a drip tray that you can place under the sprayer when you're doing that. You should note the location of water bodies and also field drains where they're present in advance of spraying. And particularly if you're bringing in a contractor, it's important to point out those kind of features, because obviously you have to implement buffer zones and possibly safeguard zones as well when you're spraying. In relation to spraying then in the field, you should try and keep the boom height as low as possible. Obviously that will reduce spray drift, and also consider maybe drift reducible nozzles. And when you're finished spraying, then one of the critical things, and probably the highest risk operation and the whole procedure revolves around washing down the sprayer. In the past, maybe farmers may have done this in the farmyard and washed out the sprayer out on the concrete or on gravel. So that's a no-no. So you must do that correctly and do it in the field and spray out the washings then, the tank washings out in the field that you've sprayed. And the last thing then will be obviously regarding triple rinsing. When you're finished with the container, it needs to be triple rinsed and recycled as you would normal plastics.
Just when you mentioned cleaning out the sprayer, say if you're gone from glyphosate and you want to put in like a broadleaf spray, and you go up to the yard and you said that's one of the biggest risks when you wash out the sprayer into a yard drain. The drain is connected to the river. And look, I'll put my hand up to doing this maybe 20 years ago when I wasn't as familiar with the issues around it. And I'm sure it's something people are starting to get familiar with much more so now from the work the likes of yourself are doing and ourselves are doing on the ground. So I think that's vitally important. It's a simple practice that you can solve. The other one that I think I've come across is filling sprayers out of the river, Kieran. That's not great practice either, I'd say.
No, and that was one of the bad practices that I identified in the survey I did a number of years ago. There was something like 4% I think of farmers identified that as occurring on their farms. Now I would think that by and large it's something in the past. I think that most farmers, or the majority of farmers at this stage, would be aware of the importance of that. And indeed, contractors will be well aware of it.
Yeah, and contractors play a much bigger role now as well, I suppose, to take that extra job out of the farmers' hands, which is great. And they've good kit and they're very experienced and they have the training, so it's very helpful.
Yeah, and I think I think Cathal, that's probably the key message that we can give in terms of pesticide use and water quality, protecting water quality. Like the grassland farmer in general is probably only spraying once a year and maybe less. So in a situation like that, I think it's best to bring in a contractor to do that kind of work. Yeah, he's far more competent in terms of what should be done.
It's a good point. One thing that just a question that comes up a bit, Kieran, weed lickers. Why can't you spread MCPA with a weed licker or put it in it?
Well, to be blunt, it's not registered for use, full stop, in a weed licker. So that's the reason you can't use it.
Yeah.
But to explain maybe the risks if one was to use it, or if it was to be registered in a weed licker for use in a weed licker, there are much greater risks attached, and that would include. We'll say normally when you're putting glyphosate into a weed licker, you're using a higher concentration of the pesticide. So if you were to do that with MCPA, you're running a greater risk, and it particularly then there's also a risk of more drips coming from a weed licker or a weed wiper.
Yeah. Can you just quickly explain what a weed licker is as well, or a weed wiper?
A weed licker is generally something with maybe bristles on the applicator that touches the vegetation or the weed, whereas a wiper is generally a roll or maybe a carpet that kind of rolls and just gently touches the weed. But in both situations, there is an added risk of drip coming from the applicator. And the other important point is, again, if you were to put MCPA in a weed licker, and you, particularly if you were using a quad to pull the machine, again, you're giving the farmer an increased opportunity maybe to carry out that kind of activity on saturated soils or close to saturation, because obviously a quad can travel easier in that kind of situation than a tractor and a boom sprayer.
And MCPA is a problem because it's probably the one that's coming up an awful lot in water, and it's when MCPA hits water, it generally goes wherever the water goes. It doesn't stay on the land too easily.
Yeah, well, I suppose it has a couple of characteristics that lends it to be much higher risk from an environmental perspective, not from a public health perspective, but from environmentally, it's highly soluble in water. it's highly persistent, particularly in anaerobic conditions. So if there's water present in the field, it's going to be highly persistent. Normally its half-life is about 20 days, but in the anaerobic condition, it can increase to 100 days plus. You know, so they're the reasons why it's so much riskier. And of course it's high usage. It's used by a lot of farmers, and it's a relatively cheap product to use as well.
We've seen now that there's a huge amount of education campaigns and a huge effort put into compliance with pesticides and everything, you know, to do with pesticides nationally. But say, for example, for those of us who don't want to see pesticide as their first port of call, what other types or methods could you use, Kieran, to control weeds in grassland lays, for example?
Well, I suppose the chemical control should be your last resort or last step in terms of the process. So you should certainly start with trying to improve soil fertility, liming, drainage in the field. Maybe try to improve the sward, the vegetation that's present, and of course the other tool would be to consider using mechanical means such as topping or cutting with a mower. So they will be the first approaches you take, and obviously then you need to discuss with your advisor whether you need to go further and maybe consider chemical control. Now the department, going back to the rush, the department have a new strategy that they're advising farmers, depending on their own situation, depending on how intensive the farm is. They have a choice of kind of going the containment route or the suppression route, and they're suggesting farmers that are extensive on farming on poor soils, poor drainage, high rainfall areas, and maybe a higher risk to water bodies, that they should be confining using topping or cutting of rushes, as against the more intensive farmers that have better soils, that they can justify chemical control, so they can use suppression in that case.
One final thing there, Kieran, I suppose, coming away a little bit from farming, we'll leave you alone after this, but I saw in a presentation there recently where glyphosate has gone up in exceedances or findings in the water, and the guy giving the presentation said that he thought it was down to COVID and the fact that maybe the hobby kind of gardeners or whatever were maybe applying a little bit too much around their yards, in the fact that they're home a lot and the glyphosate is getting into the water. Have you heard that?
Yeah, we'll say that up to this year, the last couple of years, the number of exceedances, fortunately, had been dropping each year. But this year, or in 2020, they increased from 82 in 2019 to 91 in 2020, and they do suspect that increase related to the increase in the exceedances of glyphosate. Normally, in the last couple of years, you'd only have maybe 2 or 3 exceedances of glyphosate during the year, whereas last year there was 10 exceedances recorded, and they do suspect that because the public were in lockdown and were at home busy looking after their gardens, maybe they were spraying more weeds and trying to control vegetation around the house.
Yeah, let the weeds grow. Bit of biodiversity, get a few bees
let
around.
The weeds grow and let the bees thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose finishing on a farming note, then would you be confident then, Kieran, if we do follow the steps and do the right thing, that we can bring down these exceedances, I suppose, and support the farmers and give advice and help them to do the right thing?
Yeah, look, it's all about trying to increase awareness, but I don't like finishing on a negative note, maybe, but last weekend I happened to actually go into the local merchant to purchase a small amount of pesticide that I needed, and while I was in there, the merchant was having a conversation with another farmer. Now the poor individual, I happened to come in, of course he didn't know who I was or what I was, but the merchant knew, of course, exactly that I was working with ASSAP and Teagasc, he kind of brought me into the conversation immediately. And what happened was the farmer had a sprayer himself at home, but he had no idea how to use it, or what volume of it was MCPA he was hoping to buy to control rushes. And he had no idea how much to use or how much to put into the sprayer. So I gave him the advice, the best advice I could. He wasn't trained, he wasn't a professional user, so I went through all of that with him and explained it all. But I think the message here is that there's still a small percentage of farmers, that the hard to get farmers that we still haven't engaged with, and maybe these are the lads that are contributing to the issue of exceedances. That's what I suspect.
Yeah, and look, Deirdre, I think it's something we've discussed before, where it's important that everybody that's given advice is singing out from the one hymn sheet first and foremost, but that we try and I suppose link up with everybody in the farming community. And look, farming is one aspect to it, but there's other aspects of pesticides as well. But I suppose it's our job to try and link up with as many farmers as we can.
Another thing I suppose I'd like to add to it as well is that, I know in our region and in most regions, and it's been Teagasc's policy for many years now, is to promote good pesticide use. It's been part of courses, the GLOS course, it's been part of educational campaigns, it's been built into discussion group information, event information, and the huge importance of these education campaigns at reaching out to clients, non-clients of Teagasc. And I suppose the whole area and effort around compliance and the importance of compliance with the use of these pesticides has been strongly reiterated over a good many years now in Teagasc. So I think we are doing a very, very good job of getting a good positive message out there with the use of pesticides.
Yeah, and look, for any farmers that have questions or an idea, obviously the first port of call is the label. But don't be afraid, pick up the phone to Teagasc, your advisor or your local advisor, and ask the question, and we're there to give help.
Can I just finish? Probably there needs to be more, because the retailer or the merchant is the first point of contact with the person who's buying the chemical. I think there's probably going to be a need to maybe look at given that person maybe an increased role in terms of the whole process, because they're the critical ones.
Yeah, so look, I think that's a really important note to finish on, because that's the first point of contact when you're going to buy a pesticide. So I think that's something to think about going into the future. So look, thank you very much, Kieran. That was excellent, and best of luck with your role on the National Pesticide and Drinking Water Action Group. And as an ASSAP advisor and colleague, we'll chat to you again in the future, I'm sure.
Thank you, Kieran.
Thanks, Deirdre. Thanks, Cathal. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Kieran Kenny of Teagasc for chatting to us today.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.